there is a smell that most people over 40 carry somewhere in the back of their memory. They cannot always name it, but the moment it arrives, something inside them goes very still. It is the smell of tomato leaves in the heat of a July afternoon, or wet soil after the first rain of spring, or something cut green, something sharp and alive, something that existed long before supermarkets wrapped everything in plastic and made it last 3 weeks without wilting. If you had a grandparent who kept a garden, you know this smell. You probably spent time in that garden as a child without fully understanding what you were witnessing. You pulled weeds when you were asked. You ate things directly from the plant, and they tasted unlike anything you have bought since. You watched hands that were older than yours move through that space with a kind of quiet authority you did not have words for at the time. And then life moved. You grew up. The garden was still there for a while, and then it was not. And you stopped thinking about it the way you stopped thinking about most things that were simply always present when you were young. But here is the thing. You are thinking about it now. Maybe you have been thinking about it for a while without calling it by its name. The pull toward something slower. The urge to put your hands in soil. The way a seed catalog can hold your attention in a way that almost nothing else can. The strange feeling that you are missing something, and that this something is not a place or a person but a way of being in the world. That feeling is not random. It is not nostalgia in the cheap sense of the word. It is something older and more important than that. The garden your grandparents kept was not just a garden. And the longer you sit with that thought, the more you realize that what happened there, what was grown there, what was said and not said between those rows of beans and beetroot, and whatever else they put in the ground, it was a kind of knowledge, a way of understanding life that most people born after 1970 were never quite handed. Not because it was hidden, not because anyone decided to keep it from you, but because it was the kind of thing that cannot be explained. It can only be shown. And by the time most of us were old enough to pay attention, the person who could have shown us was gone. This video is about that knowledge, about what your grandparents understood that has quietly disappeared from modern life, about the specific things they grew, the specific way they worked, the specific silence they kept while they were doing it, and what all of that was actually for. And about why, now that you are roughly the age they were when you remember them most clearly, something in you already knows that what they had is exactly what you need. We will get there. But first, I want to take you back to that garden. Because there is a detail there, something most people noticed as children but never quite examined, and it is the key to everything that follows. The garden was always in use, even when nothing was being harvested, even when nothing was being planted. It was always being tended, always being watched, and the person who kept it almost never explained why. They were not performing for anyone. The garden did not require an audience. It did not ask to be photographed or shared. It simply required presence. Regular, quiet, unhurried presence. What did they know that they were not saying? That is the question we are going to sit with today. And the answer is not simple, but it is real. And by the end of this, I think you will feel it the way you felt it as a child, standing barefoot in warm earth, not knowing what you were absorbing, but absorbing it anyway. The first place to look is in what they grew, not how they grew it, not why. What? Because what your grandparents chose to put in the ground tells you something specific about how they saw the world. And when you compare that to what most people grow today, or choose to buy instead of growing, something becomes visible that should not have been allowed to disappear. And once you see it, you will not be able to stop seeing it. Walk into any large garden center today, and you will find the same 30 or 40 vegetable varieties. The same cherry tomatoes with the same cheerful names. The same climbing beans bred for uniform size and easy transport. The same hybrid courgette that produces so relentlessly, You end up leaving bags of them on your neighbor's doorsteps by August. They are fine. They grow well. They are predictable. But predictability was not the point. Your grandparents, if they grew vegetables at all, likely grew things you cannot easily find anymore. Not because those varieties were rare at the time, because they were simply what was available, what had been passed down, what had been grown in that particular soil in that particular corner of a particular town for longer than anyone in the family could quite remember. There is a runner bean called Painted Lady that has been grown in Britain since at least the 1600s. It produces pods streaked with red and cream. It tastes different from modern varieties. Not dramatically different, but noticeably. There is something more complex in it, something slightly more bitter and then more sweet. People who have eaten it describe trying to explain the difference and finding they cannot quite do it in words. It is that kind of difference, the kind you feel more than you measure. Most of those varieties are now kept alive by small seed-saving networks, by a handful of organizations whose entire purpose is to make sure things like Painted Lady beans and Mardock beans and sea kale and scorzonera do not completely vanish from the world. Not because they are dramatically superior to modern equivalents, but because what they carry inside them, the genetic memory of centuries of selection by people who grew them to eat and not to sell, represents something irreplaceable. Is it strange that we needed organization to keep basic food plants from disappearing? Stop for a moment and sit with that. In the space of roughly 2 generations, the diversity of what ordinary people grew in their back gardens went from something vast and local and layered to something narrow and global and interchangeable. The forces that caused this are not mysterious. Industrial food systems selected for yield and shelf life. Seed companies consolidated. Small local varieties with no commercial value quietly stopped being sold. And without anyone deciding it, without any single moment of loss, the knowledge of how to grow them went with them. Your grandparents were often the last people in many families who knew that a particular potato variety, the one they had always grown, had a skin that came off almost without effort after boiling, and a taste that nothing from a supermarket bag has ever quite matched. They did not think of this as special knowledge. It was simply what they knew. They had not been taught it formally. They had watched it. They had done it. And they had assumed, reasonably, that someone younger was watching them. Often no one was. This is not anyone's fault. The shift happened too quickly for most families to catch it. Life moved into cities. Gardens got smaller or disappeared. Food became something you bought rather than something you tended. And the specific, granular, deeply practical knowledge of what to grow and how to grow it, the knowledge your grandparents carried as casually as they carried their keys, simply had nowhere to land. What remains, for many people over 40, is a faint but persistent sense of having missed something. Not a fact, not a recipe, something more like a whole language, a way of relating to food and soil and seasons that you watch from a distance as a child and cannot quite reconstruct from memory because you were never formally taught it. You were simply meant to absorb it by being there, and life moved you away before it fully took. But here is what I want you to notice. The varieties are not the point. They matter, and we should not let them disappear. But the loss of a particular bean variety is not the thing that actually haunts most people when they think about those gardens. The thing that haunts them is harder to name. It has to do with what the gardener was like while they were in the garden. The way they moved. The way they did not seem to be in a hurry. The way they could look at a plant and know something you could not see. That is what the next part of this is about. There is something specific that happens when you remember an older relative in their garden. And it is not what you might expect. It is not the things they said. It is the silence. If you try to reconstruct an afternoon in that garden from memory, what comes back first is usually not a conversation. It is a quality of attention. The way they could crouch beside a plant for a long time without moving. The way they seemed to be listening for something. The way they could pull a weed with one hand while looking at something 3 rows away, as if the garden were a sentence they were reading and they had found an interesting word. They rarely explained what they were doing while they were doing it. Not because they were secretive, but because they were focused. And the focus was complete in a way that is genuinely hard to find in modern life. We now know, from decades of research into attention and cognitive performance, that this kind of absorbed, unhurried focus, the kind where the task in front of you takes up the whole of your awareness without any sense of urgency, is one of the most restorative states a human nervous system can enter. It is not passive. It is not daydreaming. It is something more like what athletes call being in the zone, except slower. Much slower. Gardeners found this state not because they were trying to find it. They found it because the garden demanded it. You cannot rush a tomato. You cannot multitask while training a climbing rose. The plant either gets your full attention or it does not get what it needs. And over time, the habit of bringing your whole self to a slow task without needing it to be faster or easier or more productive than it is, that habit became part of who the gardener was. Have you ever watched someone garden who has been doing it for decades? Really watched? There is a quality of ease that is not the same as laziness. It looks almost like they are barely trying. But nothing is being missed. Every plant is seen. Every change is registered. They are working at the speed the garden requires. Not faster, not slower. And in that rhythm, something happens to them that is visible on their face, in their posture, in the way they breathe. They look like people who are where they are supposed to be. This is rarer than it sounds. Most of us spend large portions of our days either trying to catch up or waiting for something better to start. We are either behind or ahead of where we are. The present moment is a transit point, not a destination. And this costs something. It costs something in health. It costs something in attention. It costs something in the quality of time, which becomes this thin, fast, slightly anxious experience of events passing before we can settle into them. The gardener, the kind who has gardened long enough for it to have shaped them, does not experience time that way. At least not in the garden. And often not outside it either, because the habit is transferable. The capacity to be fully present in one place trains you to be present in others. Your grandparents may not have called it mindfulness. They almost certainly did not. That word did not exist for them in its modern form. But what they practiced, day after day, season after season, between those rows of whatever they grew, was something older and more durable than any wellness trend. It was simply the practice of being in a place and paying attention to what was there. And something about that practice, something about the accumulated weight of years spent giving full attention to slow things, showed up in who they were. In the patience they had. In the way they could sit with difficulty without immediately trying to fix or escape it. In the steadiness that the people around them often relied on, without knowing exactly where it came from. The garden was making them. Slowly, quietly, without anyone remarking on it. But what was the garden actually for? Because if you ask most people what their grandparents were doing in the garden, the answer that comes first is always practical. Growing food, keeping busy, getting fresh air. And all of that is true. But it is not the whole truth. And the part that is missing is the part that matters most. Here is something that is almost never said plainly, so I am going to say it plainly. The generations who built and tended those gardens were not working from an abundance of options. They were not choosing slow living as a philosophy. They were not selecting gardening from a list of possible hobbies or wellness practices. Many of them had grown up in conditions where the food in the garden was not supplementary. It was necessary. And the habits, the rhythms, The knowledge they carried had been shaped by that necessity over years and decades, and sometimes generations before them. But here is the thing about necessity. It teaches you something that choice almost never does. When you garden because you must, you learn the garden completely. You learn what it gives in each season and what it cannot give. You learn to work with its limits rather than expecting it to work with yours. You learn to preserve what is abundant in summer against what will be scarce in winter. You learn patience not as a virtue you cultivate, but as a simple practical requirement of the task. And then something happens. Even when the necessity passes, even when the supermarket makes it easier to buy than to grow, the practice remains. Not out of habit exactly, out of something harder to name. Because the garden was never only about food. Think about what a garden actually provides to a person over the course of a year. Not the vegetables, the experience. You go out into it in the same season, year after year, and you notice what is different and what is the same. The first snowdrop in February, the smell when the soil warms in April, the specific chaos of July when everything is growing faster than you can keep up with it, the quiet of November when the beds are cleared and resting, and you stand there looking at nothing much and feeling strangely like you are exactly where you need to be. That cycle, repeated over years, does something to a person. It teaches the body and the mind that loss is seasonal, not permanent. That things that go quiet come back. That there is a rhythm underneath the surface of experience that is more reliable than any particular outcome. This is a kind of knowledge that is genuinely difficult to arrive at by other means. You can read about it. You can be told it. But the body learns it slowly, through repetition, through the physical experience of planting something and watching it fail and planting again. Through the year that the late frost took everything in May and you had to start over, and you did, and by September it was fine. Through the decade where the same bed kept producing, and then the year it simply did not, and you had to figure out why. And in figuring it out, you understood something about soil you had never quite understood before. What would you call that kind of knowledge? It is not information. You cannot search for it or put it in a book. It is closer to what some people call wisdom, which is not a word we use easily because it sounds old-fashioned and slightly pious. But wisdom is simply knowledge that has been lived through. Understanding that arrived not from reading, but from doing, failing, adjusting, and doing again. Your grandparents had it, not because they were exceptional people, but because the garden kept asking them questions, year after year, and they kept showing up to find out the answers. And here is what I want you to hold on to before we go further. That same garden with its same questions and its same rhythms is still available. The seeds still exist. The soil is still there. The seasons have not changed. What has changed is whether anyone is paying attention. And the reason more people over 40 are starting to pay attention now, starting to feel that pull towards something slower and more rooted, is not coincidence. It is something older recognizing itself. But there is a problem, and it is a real one. The knowledge your grandparents had was not just philosophical. It was practical. It was specific. And it was meant to be passed down in a way that, for most families, it simply was not. There is a gap, a whole generation, sometimes two, where the transmission was interrupted. And what was lost in that interruption is exactly what we are going to look at next. There is a particular kind of frustration that people who come to gardening later in life often describe. They know they want to do it. They feel the pull. They buy the seeds, the tools, the books. They dig over a bed and plant something with real intention and real hope. And then things go wrong in ways no book quite prepared them for. The seedlings damp off before they can be transplanted. The tomatoes split. Something eats the kale before it has a chance to establish. The courgette produces exactly one courgette and then collapses for no visible reason. And there is a gap between what was expected and what actually happened that can be genuinely disheartening. Not because gardening is impossibly difficult, but because gardening at this level, the level of real practical working knowledge, was never meant to be learned from books alone. It was meant to be learned alongside someone who already knew. Someone who could look at your seedlings and tell you in 30 seconds what was wrong. Someone who could take the soil in their hand and say, this needs lime, or this is too wet, or you can plant here but not there, not with what you want to grow. That person, for most people over 40, was a grandparent, and the window where you could have learned from them was either missed or was too short. You were a child when they knew the most, and by the time you were old enough to really ask the questions, they were no longer there to answer. This is the gap. The generation of people who grew up eating from gardens, but did not learn to tend them, who absorbed the products of that knowledge without absorbing the knowledge itself, who understood intuitively that a ripe tomato from the garden tastes different from a shop tomato, but who were never shown how to get a tomato plant through the critical first 4 weeks. And this gap matters more now than it did 20 years ago. Because the world those grandparents navigated, the world of regular physical work and seasonal food, and a different relationship to effort and patience and time, that world has been replaced by something faster and more frictionless, and the replacement has not been without cost. There is growing research on what happens to well-being when people lose contact with physical, seasonal, skill-requiring work. When everything they consume, from food to entertainment to information, arrives instantly and is designed for maximum ease and minimum friction. The research does not suggest that ease is bad, but it does suggest that human beings seem to need some amount of effortful, patient work that unfolds over long timescales in order to feel well and whole, and like their life has weight and meaning. Gardening is one of the oldest answers to that need. And the people who learned it from their grandparents, even partially, even imperfectly, carry something that is genuinely useful. Not just the practical knowledge of which end of a seed goes down, but the felt understanding that slow things have value. That waiting is not the same as wasting. That a task which takes weeks to complete and requires your attention throughout is not less worthwhile than a task you can finish in an afternoon. Your grandparents knew this. It showed in how they worked, in the way they never seemed to be in a hurry in the garden even when there was real urgency, a frost coming, something that needed to get in the ground this week or it would be too late. There was urgency, but there was no panic, because they trusted the process. They had seen it work before. They knew that if they did what needed doing in the right order at roughly the right time, it would be enough. That trust is what got skipped, not because anyone meant to skip it, but because the transmission was broken, and most people did not realize what they had lost until they were standing in a garden of their own, wanting to feel what their grandparents felt, and not quite knowing how to get there. The question is whether it can be recovered, whether the knowledge that was meant to be handed down can still be found, whether you can arrive at what your grandparents had, even starting now, even starting late. And the answer, it turns out, is more interesting than a simple yes or no. There is something that happens to the way time feels after 40. Most people notice it but struggle to explain it to anyone younger, partly because the experience is genuinely difficult to put into words, and partly because younger people cannot quite believe it yet. Time starts to feel less like an open field and more like something with edges. Not in a frightening way, necessarily, but in a clarifying way. The urgency to do everything at once, to keep all the options open, to never quite commit to one direction for fear of missing another, that urgency starts to quiet. And in the quieting, something else becomes possible. A different kind of attention, a willingness to go deep into one thing rather than wide across many. This is exactly what a garden requires. And this is why so many people find themselves pulled toward gardening specifically in midlife, not in their 20s when they had more time and arguably more energy. Because the disposition that gardening asks for, the patience, The tolerance of slow returns, the capacity to invest in something whose payoff is weeks or months away, does not come easily in the first half of life. It tends to arrive alongside everything else that arrives in the second half. The reordering of priorities, the shift from ambition to meaning, the growing sense that what you do with your time and attention is not a minor question. When you feel the pull toward a garden, you are feeling something specific, not just a lifestyle preference, not just a hobby calling to you. You are feeling the gravitational pull of a way of being that your body and mind already know is good for you, even if you cannot yet articulate exactly why. And here is what that pull is really pointing toward. It is pointing toward the experience your grandparents had without seeking it. The experience of being genuinely in contact with something real and slow and outside of yourself. Something that does not care what you achieve this week, or what you are worried about, or what your inbox looks like. Something that simply needs attention and responds to care. Something that grows. There is a word that gets used in psychology for this quality of attention. Flow. The state of being absorbed enough in what you are doing that the sense of self, with all its anxieties and narratives and running commentary, goes quiet. And what you are left with is just the doing. Just the task and the attention and the particular satisfaction of a kind of work that asks something of you and gives something back. Gardeners find this state reliably, especially gardeners who have been at it long enough that the basic skills are established and the work itself has become its own kind of conversation. When you know your soil well enough that you can feel what it needs, when you have grown the same plants through enough seasons that their timing and their moods are familiar to you, the garden becomes a place where you arrive and something in you settles. Not because nothing is wrong, but because the wrongness waits at the gate. Your grandparents had this. It was written in how they aged. There is research, and it is quite consistent, showing that people who maintain a garden into later life tend to have better physical health, better cognitive function, and better scores on almost every measure of subjective well-being than people who do not. The mechanisms are multiple. The physical activity, the exposure to sunlight and the soil microbiome, the cognitive engagement of planning and problem solving, the social connection for those who garden with others or share the produce. But underneath all the mechanisms is something simpler. People who garden have a reason to pay attention to something growing. And having something growing, something you are responsible for and invested in and watching change over time, that turns out to be one of the most important things a human being can have. Your grandparents did not need a study to tell them this. They felt it. They felt it every morning when they went out to check what had happened overnight. Every time they looked out the kitchen window at the beds. Every time they came in from the garden with something in their hands, something they had grown, something they were going to eat, and the simple, unargued satisfaction of that whole chain was visible on their face. That is what is drawing you back. The memory of that face. The sense that they had something you want. Something that is not complicated to describe, but requires something from you to find. And what it requires, it turns out, is almost exactly what they gave to it. Time, attention, a willingness to begin. Let me bring you back to the beginning. That afternoon, that garden, the smell that comes back before you can name it. You are standing there again. Maybe 8 years old, maybe 10. The light is doing that specific late afternoon thing where it comes in low and golden and makes the whole garden look lit from within. The tomato leaves smell the way they will always smell, of something specific and alive that no perfume has ever quite captured. And somewhere nearby, someone older than you is moving between the rows with that ease, that complete unhurried attention that you have been trying to understand ever since. You did not ask them what they were doing because it seemed obvious. They were gardening. You did not know there was anything to ask. But now you do. You know that what you were watching was not simple, that the ease took years to arrive at. That behind the quiet attention was a body of knowledge that was practical and philosophical at the same time, and that it had been built not through reading or study, but through showing up, season after season, and letting the garden teach them. You know that what they grew was not interchangeable with what you can buy in a shop, that the varieties they tended carried something the modern equivalents do not, and that the taste you remember was real, not nostalgia. You know that the silence they kept was not absence. It was presence, the most complete kind of presence, the kind most of us spend our whole lives trying to find, and then stumbling onto by accident, usually in the middle of something we are doing with our hands. You know that the garden was doing something to them, that the decades of slow attention, the annual ritual of beginning again in spring and completing in autumn, the repeated experience of loss and return and abundance and preparation, had shaped them at a level that showed up in their patience and their steadiness and the particular quality of peace that surrounded them. And you know that the knowledge they carried, the knowledge that was meant to come to you and did not arrive in the way it was supposed to, is not gone. It is in the ground. It is in the seeds. It is in the same season, cycling the same way they always have. It is waiting to be asked for again. The question your grandparents never said out loud, the thing they were doing in the garden that they did not call by any name, was not a secret they were keeping. It was a secret they were living, and the only way they knew to pass it on was to be seen doing it, to be visible day after day in that patient, unhurried state, and trust that someone was watching. Someone was watching. You were watching, and now you are old enough to understand what you saw. The garden your grandparents kept is still there, in a sense. It exists wherever someone puts seeds in the ground and tends them through a season and learns, again, that slow things have their own authority, that what you grow with your hands feeds you in more ways than one. That presence in a garden, real presence, the kind that makes everything else go quiet for a while, is not an escape from life. It is one of the oldest ways of living it. If there is one thing to carry from today, let it be this. It is not too late to inherit what was meant for you. You do not need to have been taught it young. You do not need someone to hand it to you. You need only what your grandparents had. A piece of ground, a little patience, and the willingness to begin.